Don't look up. Keep talking to your dad, my husband whispered while we were having family dinner. I thought he was being paranoid until I realized what he'd discovered hiding in the ceiling above our heads. Sunday dinner at my parents' house had always been a tradition in our family. Every week, without fail, my mother would prepare her famous pot roast, and the whole family would gather around the old oak dining table that had been passed down through 3 generations. My husband David and I had been married for 6 years, and he'd become accustomed to these weekly gatherings. My parents, William and Helen, had welcomed him into the family with open arms. My younger brother Ryan usually joined us with his girlfriend Jessica, and sometimes my older sister Miranda would drive down from the city with her twin daughters. That particular Sunday in October started like any other. David and I arrived at my childhood home around 4 o'clock, bringing dessert as always, my mother's favorite apple pie from the bakery downtown. The house smelled like home, roasted meat, fresh bread, and that distinctive blend of lavender and vanilla candles my mother loved. "There's my favorite son-in-law," Dad called out as we walked through the front door. It was his usual joke, since David was his only son-in-law. "Good to see you too, William," David replied, shaking hands with my father in that formal way men do, even after years of knowing each other. Mom bustled out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her floral apron. "Perfect timing. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. David, how was your week at the office?" We settled into our usual pre-dinner routine. Dad offered David a beer, and they wandered into the living room to discuss whatever sporting event was currently consuming Dad's attention. Mom and I chatted in the kitchen while she put the finishing touches on dinner. "How are things with you two?" Mom asked, lowering her voice as if David might overhear from the next room. "Any news you want to share?" She was fishing, as always, for hints about grandchildren. At 32, I was constantly fielding these subtle inquiries from well-meaning family members. "We're good, Mom, just taking things as they come." She nodded, but I could see the slight disappointment in her eyes. Mom had been not so subtly hinting about wanting to be a grandmother for the past 2 years. Ryan arrived just as we were sitting down to eat, apologizing for Jessica's absence. She had come down with a stomach bug. Miranda had called earlier to cancel, citing a school project emergency with one of the twins, so it was just the 4 of us around the big table: Mom, Dad, David, Ryan, and me. The dining room felt a bit empty without the usual crowd, but it also felt more intimate, more like the family dinners of my childhood, before everyone grew up and got complicated lives. Dad said grace, as he always did, and we began passing dishes around the table. Mom had outdone herself. Pot roast with vegetables, mashed potatoes, fresh rolls, green bean casserole, and her famous cornbread stuffing. "This looks incredible, Helen," David said, loading his plate. "You've really outdone yourself." Mom beamed. She'd always been proud of her cooking, and David's genuine appreciation had won him major points in her book from the very beginning. The conversation flowed easily. Dad told us about his latest project in the workshop. He was building a new birdhouse, his 15th this year. Ryan shared stories from his job at the marketing firm, including a particularly amusing account of a client who wanted to advertise dog food using footage of cats. I was laughing at Ryan's story when David suddenly went very still beside me. I glanced at him and saw that his expression had changed completely. He was staring at something, but trying not to be obvious about it. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice so low I almost didn't hear him over the conversation. "Don't look up. Keep talking to your dad." My blood went cold. David wasn't the type to play pranks or make dramatic statements without reason. In 6 years of marriage, I'd learned to trust his instincts completely. If he was telling me not to look up, there was a very good reason. But every fiber of my being wanted to look up. The human impulse, when someone tells you not to look at something, is to immediately look at that exact thing. Instead, I forced myself to turn toward my father, who was in the middle of explaining his technique for weatherproofing birdhouses. "That's fascinating, Dad," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. "How many coats of sealant do you usually apply?" My father launched into a detailed explanation of wood preservation techniques while I tried to appear interested, but my mind was racing. What had David seen above us? What could be hiding in the ceiling that would make him react like that? Our dining room had a high ceiling with exposed wooden beams, a feature my parents had always been proud of. The beams created shadows and nooks that could easily hide. What? My imagination started running wild. David's hand found mine under the table and squeezed gently. It was both reassuring and terrifying. He was trying to keep me calm, but the fact that he felt the need to do so suggested that whatever he'd seen was serious. "I think I need to use the restroom," David said suddenly, standing up from the table. "Excuse me for just a moment." "Of course, dear," Mom said absently, focused on cutting another slice of pot roast for Ryan. David walked toward the hallway that led to the guest bathroom, but I noticed he took a slightly different path than usual, one that would give him a different angle to view the ceiling. I continued my conversation with Dad, asking follow-up questions about his woodworking projects, anything to keep the discussion going normally, but inside I was panicking. The minutes stretched endlessly while David was gone. When he returned, he looked even more tense. He sat down and immediately leaned toward me. "We need to leave," he whispered, so quietly I could barely make out the words. "But we need to do it naturally. Don't alarm anyone." This was getting more frightening by the minute. I trusted David completely, but part of me wondered if he might be overreacting to something harmless. Maybe he'd seen a large spider or a mouse. Maybe there was a water stain that suggested a leak, but the expression on his face told me this wasn't about household maintenance issues. "I'm feeling a bit under the weather," I said suddenly, placing my hand on my stomach. "I think I might need to head home and rest." It wasn't entirely a lie. The stress of the situation was making me genuinely nauseous. "Oh no, sweetheart," Mom said, immediately concerned. "Do you have a fever? You haven't touched your dinner." "I'm sure it's nothing serious," I said, standing up slowly. "Just a bit of an upset stomach. David, would you mind if we headed home early?" "Of course," David said, also standing. "We should get you home and rested." We made our excuses and gathered our coats, with Mom fussing over me and insisting I take home some leftover soup for later. Dad and Ryan barely looked up from their discussion about football playoffs. It wasn't until we were in the car, driving away from my parents' house, that David finally told me what he'd seen. "There was someone in the ceiling," he said quietly. "Someone hiding in the rafters above the dining room table." I felt like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "What do you mean, someone? Are you sure?" "I saw movement first, just out of the corner of my eye. Then I caught a glimpse of clothing, and then I saw a face. Someone was lying across the support beams, watching us eat dinner." "That's impossible," I said, but even as the words came out, I knew David wouldn't make something like this up. When I went to the bathroom, I tried to get a better look from a different angle. I could see more clearly then. It's definitely a person, and they've been there for a while. There's some kind of makeshift setup, blankets, what looked like food containers. My hands started shaking. Someone's been living in my parents' ceiling? It looks that way. But how is that even possible? How would someone get up there? How long have they been there? "I don't know, but Emma, we need to call the police. Your parents are in danger." I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency?" "I need to report someone hiding in my parents' house. Someone's been living in their ceiling and my parents don't know." The dispatcher took our information and said officers would be dispatched immediately. We turned around and drove back toward my parents' house to meet the police. "Should we warn them?" I asked as we pulled into the driveway behind the police cars that had already arrived. "The officers will handle it," David said. "We don't want to panic whoever's up there into doing something dangerous." The next hour was a blur of activity. Police officers quietly surrounded the house while others went inside to speak with my parents. I could see Mom and Dad through the front window, looking confused and alarmed as officers explained the situation. It took almost 2 hours for the police to safely extract the intruder from the ceiling. The person, a man in his 30s, had indeed been living in the space above the dining room for what investigators later determined was approximately 6 months. His name was Trevor Brooks, and he was a drifter who had somehow discovered that my parents' house had an accessible crawl space through a damaged vent on the roof. He had been entering and leaving through the attic, living off food he stole from their kitchen during the night and surviving on rainwater he collected in containers. The most disturbing part was that he had been watching them. Trevor had drilled small holes in the ceiling that were virtually invisible from below, giving him a clear view of the dining room, living room, and kitchen. He had been observing my parents' daily routines for months. "He knew your schedules," Detective Rodriguez told us later. "He knew when your parents went to bed, when they left the house, when they had visitors. He had notebooks documenting their habits." Trevor had also been stealing small items, things so minor that my parents hadn't even noticed they were missing. A few dollars from Mom's purse, food from the pantry, batteries, small tools from Dad's workshop. But according to the psychological evaluation ordered by the court, Trevor hadn't been planning to hurt my parents. He was what experts called a voyeuristic squatter, someone who gets psychological satisfaction from secretly observing others without their knowledge. "He saw your parents as a kind of surrogate family," Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic psychologist, explained to us. "In his disturbed mind, he was participating in family life by watching your dinners, your conversations, your daily interactions." The violation felt almost worse than if he had been planning violence. The thought of this stranger watching us laugh, talk, argue, share intimate family moments for months made my skin crawl. Mom was devastated. "How did I not know?" she kept asking. "How could someone be living in my house and I didn't know?" Dad was angry, furious that someone had violated their home and privacy, but he was also shaken by how vulnerable they'd been without realizing it. "He could have done anything," Dad said. "He could have hurt Helen while I was at work. He could have come down at night while we were sleeping." The police investigation revealed the extent of Trevor's surveillance. He had been documenting not just my parents' routines, but also information about their visitors. He had notes about David and me, about Ryan and Jessica, about Miranda and her daughters. "He knew your family better than some of your actual family members knew each other," Detective Rodriguez said. "He had detailed notes about your relationships, your conversations, even your arguments." The thought that this stranger had been analyzing our family dynamics, taking notes on our personal conversations, made me feel sick. The deeper investigators dug into Trevor's activities, the more disturbing details emerged. He had created what could only be described as a comprehensive surveillance operation from the confines of my parents' attic. Police found multiple notebooks filled with observations about our family's behavior patterns, relationship dynamics, and personal habits. "He documented everything," Detective Rodriguez explained during one of our follow-up meetings. "Your mother's favorite TV shows, your father's workshop schedule, which days your brother visited, what topics made your family argue, what made you laugh. He was like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture." But perhaps most unsettling was the discovery that Trevor had been taking photographs. Using a small digital camera with a telephoto lens, he had captured hundreds of images through the tiny holes he'd drilled in the ceiling, photos of family dinners, holiday celebrations, quiet moments when my parents thought they were alone. The police had found carefully organized albums of these photos, categorized by date and family member. There were close-up shots of my mother cooking in the kitchen, my father reading his newspaper in the living room, David and me talking on the couch during visits. "Some of these photos go back 8 months, the detective said, showing us a sample of the evidence. "He's been documenting your family's life longer than we initially thought." The timeline was staggering. Trevor had been living in the ceiling space during major family events: Christmas dinner the previous year, my parents' anniversary celebration, Ryan's birthday party. He had been there, watching and photographing, during moments we considered private and intimate. "I keep thinking about all the conversations he overheard," my mother said during one of our post-investigation meetings. "Personal things about your marriage, Emma. Health concerns your father and I discussed privately, arguments we had that we never wanted the children to know about." The psychological impact on my family was profound. The knowledge that a stranger had been privy to their most personal moments, had been judging and analyzing their relationships, had been documenting their vulnerabilities, created a sense of violation that went far beyond a simple home invasion. Dr. Foster explained that this type of long-term covert surveillance could be more psychologically damaging than violent crime. When someone's privacy is violated to this extent, over such a long period, it fundamentally changes their relationship with their own home and family dynamics, she said. The investigation also revealed that Trevor had been preparing for what appeared to be a long-term stay. He had stockpiled non-perishable food items, had rigged a basic water collection system using containers and tubing connected to roof drainage, and had even installed a small battery-powered heater for the winter months. This wasn't temporary, Detective Rodriguez explained. He had set up what amounted to a permanent living space. He had no intention of leaving on his own. Trevor had also been keeping detailed financial records of my parents' spending habits. He knew when they received Social Security checks, when they paid bills, how much they typically spent on groceries. The police found evidence that he had been planning to gradually increase his theft from the household, confident that small amounts wouldn't be noticed. But most disturbing of all was the discovery of what investigators called contingency plans. Trevor had written detailed scenarios for what he would do if he was discovered, including plans to take my parents hostage or to barricade himself in the attic space. He viewed your parents' home as his home, Dr. Foster explained. In his delusional thinking, they were the intruders in his space, not the other way around. That kind of possessive delusion can be extremely dangerous when threatened. The knowledge that Trevor had been prepared for a violent confrontation, if discovered, made David's careful handling of the situation even more crucial. If we had panicked, if we had confronted Trevor directly, the outcome could have been tragic. Trevor was arrested and charged with breaking and entering, burglary, stalking, and invasion of privacy. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison and ordered him to have no contact with our family upon his release. But the damage was already done. My parents never felt safe in their house again. Mom couldn't eat in the dining room for months, constantly looking up at the ceiling. Dad installed a security system and had the entire attic space sealed off and monitored. The weekly family dinners stopped. Mom couldn't bear the thought of gathering around that table, knowing that someone had been watching us, listening to our conversations, documenting our lives. "I keep thinking about all the things we talked about," Mom said during one of our conversations after the arrest. "Private family matters, personal issues, arguments between you kids. He heard all of it." The psychological impact on my parents was severe. They both started therapy to deal with the trauma of having their privacy violated so completely. Mom developed anxiety about being watched and would constantly check locks and curtains. Dad became obsessed with home security, installing cameras and motion sensors throughout the house. 6 months after Trevor's arrest, my parents made the difficult decision to sell the house and move to a smaller place across town. They couldn't overcome the feeling of being watched, the knowledge that someone had been living above their heads, observing their most private moments. Every creak in the ceiling, every small sound. "And I think someone's up there again," Mom explained. "I can't live like that." The house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to walk and had my first birthday parties and brought David to meet my parents, was sold to strangers. With it went decades of family memories and traditions, but we were lucky. Trevor could have been violent. He could have hurt my parents, or any of us. If David hadn't noticed the movement in the ceiling that Sunday evening, Trevor might have continued his surveillance indefinitely. "What made you look up in the first place?" I asked David weeks later, after we'd had time to process what had happened. "I heard something," he said. "Just a small sound, like fabric brushing against wood. And then I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Most people would probably have dismissed it, but something felt wrong." David's observational skills and willingness to trust his instincts had potentially saved my family from something much worse. Trevor's psychological profile suggested that voyeuristic behavior often escalates over time. He was becoming bolder, Dr. Foster had explained. The fact that he was watching during family gatherings when multiple people were present suggests he was losing his fear of being caught. That's often a precursor to more direct contact. The thought of what might have happened if Trevor had decided to reveal himself during one of our family dinners still gives me nightmares. We never found out exactly how Trevor had chosen my parents' house, or how he'd discovered the vulnerable access point in their attic. The police investigation suggested he had been observing the neighborhood for weeks, looking for the right target. He wanted a family, Detective Rodriguez said. Someone stable, predictable, with regular routines he could observe and document. Your parents fit his criteria perfectly. It's been 2 years since Trevor was arrested. He's still in prison, and my parents have rebuilt their lives in their new home. They've started hosting family gatherings again, though they're smaller and more cautious than before. David and I still talk about that Sunday dinner, how a normal family meal turned into the discovery of a stranger who had been living in the shadows of our lives for months. "Don't look up. Keep talking to your dad," David had whispered, and those words saved us from what could have been a much more dangerous confrontation. Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary dangers, and sometimes the person sitting next to you at dinner is the only thing standing between your family and a threat you never saw coming. So what do you think? Would you have trusted your instincts like David did, or would you have dismissed the strange sounds and movements? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about the hidden dangers lurking in everyday situations, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell.